皆さん失礼いたします。
Shall we begin the panel discussion?
Exchanging the information, but I think that we had better to start because we really keep our time. So, and then for speakers, I think that if you want to see the slides of Takahashi-san, then you can just have a seat over there, and then afterwards you can come up. 高橋さんよろしくお願いいたします。それでは
Let us then start the panel discussion. First and foremost, Dr. Takahashi, research fellow from Fujitsu Research Institute, will provide us with his presentation. And Dr. Takahashi will be speaking for 20 minutes, taking into account what Messrs. Yamaka and Sengbusch, von Sengbusch, mentioned before. My name is Takahashi from Fujitsu Research Institute. So, Mr. Yamaka mentioned and gave us a summary of what's happening in Germany and Japan. And Dr. von Sengbusch then explained from the viewpoint of a TSO what's happening right now in Germany. So there's nothing much to add. But as this is a panel discussion, and so let me try to break the ice. And also for Japan, what are the problems, the challenges that we face? And maybe I can start the ball rolling in that way. So this is my first page. The electricity system reform is the theme that was given to this panel. And how can we reform the system so that more renewables are introduced? I think there are 4 bullet points that I have to make. First is the wide area operation. So this is the pillar for electricity system reform, and in 2015, an organization to promote wide area operation will be set up. And this would mean that more renewables could be connected. For example, Hokkaido, there's quite a lot of wind power generation possible. And if that electricity can be transmitted to Honshu, the main island, that would be for the good of the whole country. And so there are interconnections in Japan which are said to be too small, too narrow, between Hokkaido and Honshu. And the grid would have to be strengthened so that more renewables can be accepted. The second point is the neutralization, you could say, of the grid. And concerning the grid access, has been refused to many renewable projects. And that's the current situation in Japan, and we do face this issue. So in Japan too, it is projected that in 2018, there will be the legal unbundling, and the law will be passed next year for that purpose. So for TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power Company, the legal unbundling will start in 2016. That has been announced. So the generation and transmission will be legally unbundled and separated for TEPCO in 2016 and for the other companies in 2018. The third point is the electricity system reform. And this is a little different from the theme that we have right now. So creating a TSO, creating a market. For example, by 2018, with the legal unbundling, a real-time market should be created. This is the plan in the basic energy program of the government. And so the ultimate demand supply response management will be much easier done. And in Europe, what's happening is the creation of the capacity market, and that too should be carried out in Japan, or the demand response. So this is something that the Americans have pioneered, and they are a little ahead. So vis-a-vis the peak load, somehow to change that, to shift that, and to be able to respond to the variability of renewables. So to carry out demand response more aggressively or actively. And the fourth point is to have a independent regulatory authority, which Yamaka-san mentioned. This will be set up in next year, 2015. Article 3 or Article 8 organization, which is based upon the National Administrative Organization Law, Article 3 or Article 8. Article 8 is not so independent. It will report to the minister and just provide recommendations or reports. An Article 3 organization would be given more independence. So for renewables, if such an organization is set up and if such system reform is carried out, this will all be tailwinds for renewables. And what we have to look up to, I think it would be Germany. And let us look also to what is the function that a TSO, transmission company, can carry out. And I think we have to look at so a TSO like 50 Hertz. Why is it important in this overall reform? So as was mentioned previously, yes, a TSO carries out neutral and fair grid operation. Whatever electricity or power we are talking about, whatever the owner of that power plant, that electricity, that power is accepted by the grid and wheeled to where the consumer is. So an independent TSO will carry that function out. And secondly, that TSO is responsible for stable supply. So once unbundling is carried out, some Japanese critics will say there'll be blackouts all over the place. But no, the TSO's responsibility is to provide stable supply. And so the responsibility, accountability system setup would change. So through the market, the demand supply management will be carried out. There will be demand responses, or therefore there will be wide area operations. So therefore, right now there is the regional monopoly, and it's only that electric power company is only responsible for that particular service territory. It doesn't care what happens to the next territory. But then when the reform is carried out, there would have to be wide area operation, and the demand supply management would be carried out in that wide area territory. And of course, self-generation would appear in the picture as well. There would have to be very efficient and effective demand-supply management, demand responses. So, and in fact, those 2 points are unrelated to renewables, whether we talk about nuclear power or thermal, whatever. These are the functions that a TSO has to carry out. And the third will be the response to renewables. For example, towards the renewables, the preferential access was given to renewables in Germany, and this was a political decision taken and required of the TSO. Or, so both wind and solar are a variable renewable energy, and the TSO has to accept that and respond to that. And the ways to do that would be wide area operation, having backup resources, or the demand supply management, or power shedding. Or, as necessary, the grid would be constructed. as Klaus mentioned, there will be further construction of the grid or strengthening the grid as necessary. So that's the reason why I have been saying that the TSO is important. And I've met many people from 50 Hertz. I've been to Berlin to meet with 50 Hertz representatives. And the first time I met with someone from 50 Hertz, and I was impressed that isn't variability a challenge for you? Isn't it difficult to give access to renewables? But we have the mission of integrating renewables. But unless we have this challenge, this business of transmission operation is so dull. But we do have challenges, and that's why we find raison d'être, we find challenges in this business.
このグラフをですね、象徴的なので見ていただきたい。
So let's look at some symbolic or iconic graphs. As you know, in Germany, there is the unbundling of the generation and transmission. We see Vattenfall, Europe, in the middle of those 5 bars. So after the unbundling, the remaining electric power companies are indicated here. And we are seeing the fuel mix of those 4 electric power companies. And as you see, the red is nuclear. And in the middle in gray is coal. And top is renewables. So I think renewables occupy about just under 20% or so. And that's on the right-hand side indicated. That's Germany as a whole. So versus the total average for Germany, for the main 4 electric power companies of the fuel mix, the renewables is quite small. So in a sense, the 4 major electric power companies are in a very disadvantageous position because they were forced by the government to move forward with nuclear power plants and also to burn coal in order to generate electricity. So the new players that you see on these are numbers for 2012, and they've been introducing about 17% or so renewables, and these are all the power plants of the newer players. So the 4 conventional major power plants, electric power companies, have very high ratios of both coal and nuclear versus the new players who have brought in renewables. Now, what's happening in Japan? And there's criticism of the Energiewende of Germany, saying that Energiewende was a big failure. So these are the bullet points. For example, that in Germany, after the year 2000, the electricity prices have become so higher. In some areas, the electricity prices have doubled. And so I think the German economy might be stalling, stagnating, and also the renewable surcharge is about 30% of the household tariff for electricity, and many German companies are leaving Germany. And, for example, with the wide area operation, and because of the very variable situation with electricity, they're exporting 50 Hertz and other TSOs are exporting electricity to Poland and the Czech Republic, and the nuclear power generation has declined. However, there's a lot of burning of coal and lignite, and the amount of CO2 emissions have increased. And so some of those bullet points are not wrong, but if you look at the very top, concerning the household electricity tariff has risen. And as was mentioned in the other presentations, and Klaus has mentioned, but for the commercial or corporate tariff has not. And also, there has been exports to Poland and Hungary, but this is not because of the variability of renewables, but for other reasons. So I'm sure Klaus would rebut these arguments or these criticisms later on. So what's happening in Japan? We are just about to start with power market and power system reform. And that is, as you know. So we have yet to start the system reform. For example, one would be the interconnection between Hokkaido and Honshu. We cannot receive further power from Honshu. It's going to take 5 or 10 years to strengthen the interconnection between the two areas. So what's the usage or load factor for that interconnection? So this is the only connection with Hokkaido. And it's about 600 megawatts is the capacity of the interconnection. So the plus is the transmitted amount, and the green at the bottom is the received amount. As you see, so there's no transmission or reception except for 2011. So 2011, of course, was immediately after the earthquake of 3/11. So therefore, this interconnection between Hokkaido and Honshu was utilized fully because in the northern part of Honshu area, i.e. the area hit by the earthquake, there was the shortage of electricity. So therefore, of the 600 megawatts, the load factor was 65.7%. But, I mean, one doesn't have to utilize this, the interconnection to that extent. But look at 2012. It's practically unutilized. So, of course, interconnection should be strengthened, let's say, taking into account what's going to happen 10 years from now. But in order to provide stability of supply, this interconnection between Hokkaido and Honshu, I think, should be utilized a little more effectively. So from this graph, I think we can say that. Another is pumped hydro. So, I mean, in order to introduce more wind power, one has to have more storage. But more than the United States, Japan has the greatest amount of pumped hydro, 26 gigawatts. But let's look at the load factor. That's very small. Please look at the bottom graph in blue. So compared to UK, and from the left it's UK, America, Germany, Korea, France, Spain, Italy, and Japan is on the extreme right-hand side. Of course, pumped hydro is not something that one utilizes fully, but if you look at the UK on the extreme left, that's 13.12. So at the top is the load factor for all the years. It's about 5%, just under 5%. Even after the earthquake, it is declining. The load factor for pumped hydro is declining. So I think pumped hydro should be integrated more into the grid. And I think pumped hydro does have a role to play in providing stability to the grid. So if we think through all of these, the current system has its problems and shortcomings. But having said that, there are things that we could do immediately, and I think some things are happening. For example, concerning the connection to the grid, what sort of rules can we lay down, even with the bundled electric power companies in place? For example, right now, concerning the connection and the construction, the additional construction, And who would foot the bill? I mean, the power plants are asked to foot the bill for millions of yen. So in Japan, we have the sort of deep method. That is to say, the power generator has to foot the bill. So the grid strengthening costs and also the connection to the grid has to be constructed by the power plant. And of course, this in itself is not unfair, but there is the other method, such as a sort of Russian roulette, where the power generator, at which point the overall capacity is filled, he has to foot the bill for the other power plants as well. So that's a little unfair. For example, if you look at what's happening in Gunma Prefecture, the Tokyo Electric Power Company, TEPCO, is trying to decide by tender who is going to foot the bill for the strengthening of the grid. And that's a sort of starting, and I think that's a good idea. And also concerning the power shedding, there's a 30-day rule for the output control. So is this the most appropriate rule to be put into place? I think we have to think through this. Even for the power plant, I mean, you are told to control your output for 30 days. So output control should be carried out just as it is done in Germany, but it should be based upon information that's out in the public domain. And there should be a fair and rule applied on an equal basis to all. So there are many challenges and hurdles that we must overcome. So I'm sure with the reform, a brighter future will open up for Japan. But I do feel that there are many other difficulties. There are 4 points again here. The wind area
どこまで、
operation must be carried out by an organization, and I do hope that organization will be fair and equanimous. And concerning the neutralization of the grid, and the legal unbundling began about in the year 2000 in Germany. And then the holding was also separated.
独立規制機関ですね。これまだ政府から発表されてない。
And according to what's in the newspaper about the the independent regulatory authority, they, based upon the National Administration Organization law, some sort of organization will be set up. But that might not be based upon Article 3, which will give it more independence, but might be Article 8, which is not an independent organization. It will be just reporting to the minister. So Japan is a laggard compared to what's happening in Germany by 10 to 20 years. So we can learn so many lessons from Germany. Japan is behind by 10 or 20 years. So we don't have to replicate everything that's happened in Germany. We have to sort of separate the successes of Germany versus the failures and just learn from the best practice of the Germans. So I think we can. How can we sort of jump ahead of the legal unbundling and the ownership separation? So we have to find the best direction from all of the lessons that we can learn from Germany. So and in Japan, the feed-in tariff. We have to sort of find out how to minimize the cost of that, and learn from the Germans again here. So those are the issues that I see ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Takahashi, for the clear-cut explanation. So we would like to have all the speakers on the stage, please. Thomas here. I think only Japanese is shown, but Thomas over here. Klaus and Yamaka-san, please. So, at the beginning, Thomas had talked about the situation of the global renewable energy, and the investment and policies taken by Germany had contributed to renewable energy in the world. And Mr. Yamaka talked about the situation of the growth of renewable energy in Germany and comparison between that of Japan. And next, Klaus had talked about in detail the Energiewende situation, the role of TSO, and also with the new policy, he talked about the differences. And we have received quite a number of questions, close to 100 or so. And I'll try to pick up the optimum number of questions so that we can learn from each other. Now, first of all, Thomas, and then Yamaka-san, would there be anything from you after listening to the presentations? We would like to receive your comments, please. And then after that, to Klaus, please respond to the points raised by Dr. Takahashi. Thomas, please, can you start? Comments, please.
I would start by thanking Yamaka-san and Takahashi-san for very good, insightful presentations. It has been wonderful to follow during the 3 years when I have been working here in Japan the way that some bright Japanese researchers have learned about the experiences from other countries. And as Takahashi-san said, it is not a matter of copying, it is a matter of learning from both success and failures in other countries and adapt the policy reforms to the Japanese context. While I see people like my two colleagues here doing that very quickly, at the same time I find it a little frustrating that the policy development is slow. When the electricity market reform was carried out in Northern Europe in the mid-1990s, and I was on the government commission preparing that reform, our conclusion was that we had to do the full reform at one time, because during the sort of half-reformed part of the process, there would be large losses, manipulations of the market, and things that would be detrimental for the long-term development. So we had the full reform with ownership unbundling and full competition brought into practice at midnight in New Year's Eve 1995. And I'm a little worried that this slow step-by-step process in Japan will be very inefficient. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much for that. So, Mr. Yamaka, do you have any comments after listening to Klaus and other presentations? So, 50 hertz presentation. I was listening with a great interest, and massive profusion of renewable energy is important, and they find it very encouraging, but at the same time, a lot of challenges exist. And there are a lot of things that need to be undertaken in the future as well. I believe that was what was mentioned by 50 hertz. In the case of Japan, we've just started, and there are tons of things that we need to do at the initial stage. I think that's the impression that I have. So I hope that we will be able to have the same type of problems that 50 hertz are now having, because we are not yet there. And I believe we've just started. There are things that we can do. And as has been mentioned, I think there are three issues that remain with us. And I talked about that, about the site limitations, and also interconnection problems and limitations. And the third point was financing issues. So we talked about those 3 points. And regarding the site location, restrictions and limitations, environmental assessment would need to be done, and we would there are a lot of things that we need to do at that aspect. And it's often said that there's no optimum location or site, but there are optimum sites. But we haven't been able to actively use that. I think that is where we stand. And also interconnection issues. So a wide area connection leading to best efficiency. I believe that was in the explanation from 50 Hertz. And in the case of Japan, as we have heard about the interconnection between Hokkaido and Honshu, wide area connection, how in terms of operation we can adjust the supply and demand control, I think we'll be able to achieve a lot. And now, by changing the rule, there's a lot that we can do. I believe there's a lot that we can do if we just change some of the rules. And the financial restrictions, number 3. And if we try to do renewable energy in the community, and they find financial issues to be the biggest problem because the banks are not financing. They have difficulty getting that finance. So, and also, I think it's very important to look at the preferred interconnection. And also, I happen to have a background of being a banker myself. And Japanese banks probably haven't done their homework. They haven't studied much. I think there are a lot of improvements nowadays, but I think they need to learn more about this area. And we need to have their understanding and cooperation. I think that's what is required. So I hope that we can get closer to 50 Hertz so that we can have the similar problems in our minds as well. Thank you. Thank you very much. Klaus? So in Dr. Takahashi's presentation, he talked about the policies of renewable energy, misconception by Japan. Any comments to what was raised by Dr. Takahashi? Maybe we can go one by one. About the high price of electricity prices? No. And also the stagnation in the construction, and also issues related to wind, and also problems with thermal generation, because we have received quite a number of similar questions from the audience as well. So I think the largest question is, compared to Japan and Germany, the grid is quite different. And also introduction level of renewable energy also is quite different as well. So I believe we can hear responses from the rest of you. But renewable energy, vast amount of cost is necessary for adjustment. That's the thought. And in generation, if you are to adjust, there will be a lot of costs required. And how can we have a good backup in the adjustment of electricity? And when we look at the grid and also expansion of the grid, it's very difficult to get consensus from the community, for example. And how can you do that? And how are you planning to do that? And in constructing transmission lines, and now who burdens the costs related to that expansion of transmission? Those are the series of questions that we have received. Anything from you, please?
Okay, there were quite a lot of points now. At first, Mr. Takahashi, thanks for the excellent presentation. I was indeed quite surprised about some slides, especially regarding the usage of interconnectors. Normally, in a well-functioning market, interconnector is only used with 2 points of operation. That's fully loaded in one direction or fully loaded in the other direction. Yeah, that's so, and then you can't end up with the numbers you presented. So indeed, there seems to be potential for optimization, which is, I think, good, because it keeps the pressure on market reforms high, and also gives incentives that money can be saved. Yeah, and then something general to the question, learning from Germany, what's good or so. I think the big challenge here is that basically, I think there is no blueprint that was developed in Germany and now can be applied very easily in all countries. It's rather that I think it's worth looking at the problems the Germans had and how they overcame these problems. Yeah, so that's I think this is the best way to learn, because then you can decide which of the problems are similar to the ones you see and which are not. Yeah, so it's probably really not a one fits all solution that we see here. Electricity markets are very different from the structure, from generation structure. I also heard that you have a lot of pumped hydro. That's of course also good for renewables, surely. So it's that's at least my suggestion as a process to really dig into the reasons why things were done, and not to say it's a solution that Germany has developed. Now to the points that you raised, the questions that you mentioned. Now, one thing I really didn't talk much about in my presentation is the question, how can you really actually get the grid enforcements done in case the public or the stakeholders have agreed that it is social economic feasible and it's of value to extend the grid. I mean, this decision this is of course a very, very first step that one have to take, so that really everybody says yes, that's it. Now then our lessons learned was here that that this is not enough, because if it comes down that the line has to be planned and it is going through someone's backyard, you might say, well, I do agree that there is the Energiewende and good targets, but I think it's not really necessary to build that line. It's there are other options, and then with such arguments, the very few people were able to postpone projects, and this really gave a lot of problems. So the Germans thought, how could we overcome this issue? And the result was that process of the network development plan, which I try to briefly describe. The main idea is that the TSOs, they propose scenarios. Scenarios is nothing more than estimating what transmission task should have to be solved in 10, in 20 years. For 10 years, we even make 3. So we have one conservative scenario with not so much renewables, one trend scenario, and one with a lot of renewables. And then we ask the public, do you agree that these problems have to be solved? And everybody can react on this. So really everybody. So it's in the web, yeah? So it's a very, very open. And we do get reactions. It's hundreds and thousands of reactions on such a scenario consultation. And then it comes to the point where we say, okay, now we take into account all the reactions. We have the regulatory authority also involved in this process, and then we try to identify the relevant scenarios. Then we have the scenarios, no grid yet, just the scenarios which are agreed between the stakeholders. And the next step is that we suggest a grid fulfilling the needs of these scenarios. And again, we have not one grid, we have several grids, and for the different time steps and different scenarios. We ask the public, is that the right grid we suggested, or do we have better ideas? Yeah? And if someone says a better idea, then we check the idea. Yeah? And at the very end, we come to the optimal grid agreed by the stakeholders for the scenarios. And this is done every year, so it's all-year task for TSO. A lot of people involved. But it's worth it, because then you get the acceptance for the grid extension. And then there's another last step, which is even more important. Then every 3 years, the politics and the regulatory authority, they make a short list of the grid extension measures which they see in the plans. And they choose only these, where they say these are really needed anyway. Yeah? So there's no doubt that these are needed. It's relevant in all scenarios. Very short list. And if such a network extension is in this short list, then this is done every 3 years. Then there is it's not possible anymore by a single person to question if that line is necessary or not. It's a law then. it is necessary. It was agreed and it is necessary. So he has no option anymore to ask, do we need the line? He still can ask, it shouldn't go through my backyard, it should go somewhere else. But he can't question if the line is needed. And this is a very important step for us to get the lines actually built. Yeah? So it's really a process optimization that was done in the last years with a very, very relevant impact on the Energiewende in Germany. And I think at least this is, for example, one point where I think it might be really of value to look at how these processes are organized, how they are put into law. Regarding the conventional generation, I must say I'm not 100% sure if I got the question correct. I mean, Mr. Takahashi, you tackled the point of capacity mechanisms. In general, of course, there is a big issue of transforming the conventional energy system when introducing renewables. And how can you organize a process? Now, if you look at the value of the shares of the German utilities, you can see that they significantly dropped in the last years. Basically, because their investments got not worthless, but they are worth much less. It was also the situation that they bought a lot of things from money they didn't really have. So this was a decision by the utilities, a risky decision by utilities, which of course is now even making the situation even more difficult. But nevertheless, it was not foreseeable, I would say, such a development that has taken place in Germany. And of course, you can question if such a thing happens, is that fair? Yeah? Is that fair that the utilities now have to pay for the political decision taken more or less by the public? I must say I have no answer to this. A capacity mechanism is one possible answer. So basically I would say there are two reasons why in Germany capacity mechanisms are discussed. The one is the issue with the utilities not earning money anymore, and the other one is that maybe we would like to build a bit more capacity than we need. Yeah? Because if you don't have a capacity mechanism, the market only builds the capacity that's really needed. That also means there might be times where it's not sufficient, which is not so nice for politics. Yeah? So maybe it's they rather want more capacity, the politics, than actually is economically the optimum. So these are the main two reasons, and I think it's relevant reasons. Therefore it's an open discussion, no decision yet.
まだちょっとご質問ありますけど、トーマスの方が今。
I understand that there are still more questions, but I believe Thomas would like to say a few words.
You said many things, but I think the most important was the start. You noted, as I did, looking at Takahashi-san's pictures, that the Japanese electric power companies are not utilizing the infrastructure in an optimal way. That means they are wasting resources at the expense of the electricity consumers. And when the Japanese government says they want to revitalize stagnant, inefficient parts of the Japanese economy, this is a very good opportunity. Utilizing the existing power plants and infrastructure in an optimal way will immediately save a lot of money for the Japanese society and make the economy more efficient. Then you described the investments in infrastructure. And at present, it is totally impossible for anyone in Japan to make optimal investments in the infrastructure, because it is impossible to get all the data and understanding how the electricity grid works. The proposed authority to supervise the companies will have enormous difficulty. The idea of legal unbundling, I do not understand why just legal unbundling. In Europe, for the transmission grids, it is almost everywhere ownership unbundling. 50 Hertz is one example where the logic became obvious. The German legislation was extremely clear. It use the ownership of the transmission grid as an owner of power plants. And when there was no opportunity to misuse the co-ownership, Vattenfall in that case realized there was no use to own the grid when you own the power plant. Therefore, they sold off the grid to separate owners. If anyone says that there is some sort of advantage of owning both the grid and the power plants, there is something hidden and destructive behind that argument. They intend to misuse the control of the grid to benefit in some way that should not be allowed if the market really works. And if you achieve ownership unbundling, then you can make rational investments in the way that Dr. Sengbusch, von Sengbusch just described. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you. Adding to what was said, first, in Germany, there was the unbundling of the generation and transmission. What was the most difficult element in that process of unbundling? And I think to Dr. Takahashi, so unbundling in Japan, how is that going to proceed?
Okay. Now I think when we started the ownership unbundling, as Thomas mentioned, the situation was already there. There was no really a close cooperation between grid and generation anymore. So the step for the ownership unbundling indeed was on the technical side not so complex. It was more there on the organizational side. Of course, we had to set up new IT systems because everything was hosted together in a big server farm and so on. But but it was more on that operational level, not really severe problems for the unbundling. What we did saw is that the business model of a TSO is very specific, and the regulation didn't really fit to that specific needs. Before, it was more or less a grid for Vattenfall was a tool to connect their valuable assets, the generation assets, with the customers. So they even made losses with the grid, and this was accepted as it was seen as a tool providing access to customers. Now, if you have a fully unbundled TSO, it's of course not possible that the TSO makes losses. So then it would be bankrupt immediately. So we had to really establish completely new, I would say, it was really quite big change in regulation process. This was, I would say, the most difficult part for the ownership unbundling that we had. I mean, the time before, of course, the legal unbundling, there were also technical challenges as it was combined optimization of grid and generation in former times. But these things were already solved quite a while ago, and that's not in the I must say wasn't in 50 Hertz when this happened. So probably it's I'm not the right to person now to comment on this in detail. But the regulatory issues were really severe to sharpen the business model of a TSO to get the right incentives. There was a lot of negotiations, and I think also there one could learn from our experience what is suitable here to give right incentives for efficient investments.
So, Japan. What's going to happen to unbundling in Japan? So, right now in Japan, there will be legal unbundling from 2018, and the law will be passed next year. And I'm sure there's going to be some trial error, and we have to go through the winding road. But I do hope, fingers crossed, that the law will be passed and that legal unbundling will be carried out. But the question is, the problem is, what's going to happen after that? I think there are two large scenarios. Number one, okay, there's going to be legal unbundling, and that would promote competition. But that is not enough, really, to create a market with full fair competition. So the TSO is a different company, but the grid will not be opened up fully, depending on the regulatory framework. So that will then prevent full competition, and access for renewables might still be closed. Maybe you could call that the French model, the model à la française, whereby there is the legal unbundling, but yet the RTU, which is the TSO in France, is saying that there is no going to be further separation of ownership in France. So this is the national policy of France, which promotes a nuclear power generation. So that's one scenario I can imagine. Another scenario is maybe the German scenario. So there is going to be legal unbundling, and there will be competition amongst the energies and the TSO. Is it meaningful to have the TSO as a subsidiary of the electric power company? And at some point in time, I do hope that TSO will be spun out and become an independent company, and a regulatory authority will be set up to supervise that. And so the grid will be sold off, and with that money, then the proceeds of that sale, maybe that electric power company will invest in renewables, and so the TSO will open up to renewables. I think that is a wiser decision to be made by the company management, and so then I think the electric power company will choose a separation of ownership. And so with many pressure from, let's say, the general public, I'm sure this will move forward, just like in Germany. And there'll be more and more renewables accepted, and there'll be wide area operation of the network. And so this will be a positive for renewables. But on the other hand, concerning the conventional power plants, they will be put in a disadvantageous position, just as we saw in the German graph, that those nuclear power plants and coal-burning power plants will be placed in a perilous position. So this will then impact the discussion on, are we going to have centralized or decentralized power systems? And so this is something that we really have to think through. Thank you. But with unbundling, and there is fair and neutral operation, but in order to expand renewables, can we wait 8 years or 10 years? Renewables should be immediately expanded. So, and we have received many questions on that point. So on renewables, so the situation is so different in Germany and Japan. Why is that so? What is the biggest cause of having so much renewables in Germany? Yamaka-san, Thomas, any others, please? Klaus?
I
mean, if you want to do it, I'm sure renewables can be developed. There's, of course, many opinions, discussions, but ever since with the start of the feed-in tariff, I don't think anyone imagined that renewables in Japan would expand so explosively. So just as the general public, as investors, thought that, yes, this is profitable, then we have this explosion of renewables in Japan. Another point is that is for solar, but the other protagonist should have been wind, unfortunately, which is not given the spotlight. It is inexpensive, the potential is there in Japan, but the environmental assessment process is so long, so strict for wind in Japan. I think it's the strictest, the most stringent assessment in the world for wind. So it used to be taken 1 year or 2 years. Now it takes 3 or 4 or even more. So the environmental assessment is taking so long. So I think there's about 4 megawatts or so. Mm-hmm. So 4 gigawatts or so that is going through the environmental assessment. So it is extremely attractive as investment projects. So if we can go through that, so if we can break through some wall, then I'm sure there's going to be an explosive growth of wind in Japan. So there is talk about trying to halve the time taken for the environmental assessment, and also deregulation is being discussed. So renewables is essential, is necessary, and once everyone agrees on this, and if once the ministries and the agencies agree that renewables is a must, then I think it will start growing. And I'm repeating what I said in my presentation. And of course, there's going to be costs taken in the infrastructure. So there is possible to have wide area exchanges of if there is some tightening of demand supply. So wide area operation can be carried out even today if the electric power companies wish to do so. So more than everyone thinks, I think there is a possibility of expanding renewables far much faster than everyone imagines.
Indeed, it is difficult for a foreigner to understand why Japan invests a lot in solar power that still cost quite a bit, but do not invest in wind power, which is the cheapest renewable source of electricity. That appears very strange and economically a waste of resources. I hear that many projects proposed by willing investors are blocked by grid companies or electric power companies, claiming that those large, low-cost wind power plants would threaten the stability of the grid or the profitability of their coal and potentially reopen nuclear plants. And allowing such arguments to stop investments in wind power is also very strange for a foreigner who is interested in seeing the least cost, most efficient supply of electricity, also reducing imports of fuels. The issues around environmental impact assessments are certainly there, but we have seen in the rest of the world that you can learn to handle even strict environmental criteria. And the research that has been done in other parts of the world should be used here so that you don't have to do research once more, all over again, trying to understand how wind power plants interact with birds of different kinds and bats, or how offshore wind power plants affect the reproduction of cod, and other issues that have been brought up in environmental impact assessment processes elsewhere. And authorities and investors have spent a lot of money researching this, answering all the questions. You can learn from these environmental impact assessments made elsewhere and reduce the cost and time of environmental impact assessment processes in Japan too. And that would be very desirable to speed up wind power investments. They are cheap. They are probably, even in Japan, cheaper than the current marginal cost of electricity generation. So Japan would benefit immediately from increasing wind power investments. Thank you.
Maybe just to add to the correct points, some few things. One important element that Germany did was a priority of dispatch for renewables. And basically, under the term dispatch, we also mean a priority in connection to the grid. That means if there is an option to connect to the grid and a renewable energy source is interested, then it can use it, no matter if some other units are disturbed or not. And if the dispatch then is there, we have to curtail generation, then it's not the renewables to be curtailed. And there was another decision taken in Germany that in case we really have to curtail renewables, it's not the risk of the investor, so he gets compensated. One could question at least the last two things. Yeah? Is it really beneficial to take all the risks away and give the priority? And indeed, I'm not so convinced about the priority of dispatch in a way we actually do it in Germany. But it's a market result anyway. I mean, these generators have a price of 0. So also if you don't do anything on the regulatory side, then you will see a 99% priority of dispatch anyway, just because of the 0 marginal costs. And regarding the compensation, it's also a difficult issue. But we have decided in Germany that we build the grid for the renewables, and that as it is a dynamic process, it should be only a question of time until the bottlenecks have been filled up. And this, of course, is an important step, because an investor can't oversee what a TSO will do. Will he build the new line or won't he build the new line? That's one important issue. And the other one is, in case we curtail, and from a TSO perspective, and it's one windmill that is shut off, you can question, why me? Why not the other one that is located 1 kilometer away? And we wouldn't have a good argument, because for us it's the same, but it's just someone who has to participate. So you would have to introduce a mechanism with some kind of a rolling switching off, or using the costs of generators somehow to calculate a merit order list for it's very, very complicated. It's expected to give a lot of legal problems if we would curtail. So I think it's a quite good solution we actually currently have, and we as a TSO are strongly supporting that this stays in a way like it is today.
But Klaus, I would say from the experience in further north in Europe, you don't need to give renewables any priorities. You just need to treat them in a fair way.
Yeah.
And that's much easier to argue, that they should get a fair chance.
Merit order, right?
Yes. Giving priorities is not necessary. As you mentioned, 0 marginal cost for solar and wind will in practice give them advantage on the market. So I don't think we need to ask for anything more than a fair opportunity to reach the grid and the customers.
ちょっと日本の状況から
So when we look at the Japanese circumstance, I think this may be a bit difficult to understand, but Dr. Takahashi, can you mention something? Yes. So regarding the priority and also priority transmission, this would be to give privilege to renewable energy. That's how people see that. And in Germany, that was how it was considered at the beginning. But in Japan, if marginal cost is low, then you would expect, you would want to have dispatch. And this is a matter of proper economics, because you would start moving where operational cost is low, and that's the merit order concept. And as was said, wind power, for example, the marginal cost is close to zero. In reality, it's zero. So reality-wise, maybe biomass may be a bit difficult, but for renewable energy, I believe that maybe not priority, but it is something probably that would be supplied at the beginning. And I think I totally agree to that. And coming back to the original question, no, as long as it's fairly done, it would be the case. But in countries that not provide that fairness, maybe a priority or preferred rule would be required. Such rule may be necessary. And in Germany, I think in the past 10 years or so, that was how it was. It was in 1991, was it, that you had preferred transmission. Before FIT, you had priority dispatch, I think, if I remember correctly. And so 20 years ago, Germany was not fair in a sense. That's why they come up with this rule so that they can promote renewable energy. And as you see on the slide here, I think we're about 10 years, 20 years behind Germany, I think. So unfortunately, we cannot expect for fair treatment. So if that is the case, I think policy-wise, priority should be given. I think such methods, would be quite effective when considered the case. So in relation to that, now the low marginal cost was mentioned. And in today's presentation from Thomas, we heard about the decline of renewable energy, rapid decline. And that's true on one hand. And Klaus had talked about at EG, for a long period of time, cost had to be burdened. So can we have further explanation on that so the Japanese audience can understand? I think regarding billing, Mr. Yamaka talked about it quite in detail. But if it's really cheap, why is it that EG and also through FIT you're buying it at a high price? I think for the general population, it's a concept difficult to understand. Anyone to that, please?
Maybe Thomas will start and then, yeah.
I can try. The fact that the feed-in tariffs in Japan are 2 or 3 times the level of cost of solar and wind in Europe shows that and still there is not massive investments here in Japan, shows that there are some barriers or costs that are created in Japan that does not exist in the best performing countries in the world. So homemade costs in Japan are important to identify and remove. I think that one of the important barriers for investment is the control of the electricity grid. If I was considering to invest in a power plant in Japan and I knew that my competitors would control my connection to the customers, I would be worried. I would then ask for a little higher interest, which would raise the capital cost and the required price of electricity to make the investment. There are also homemade costs that we heard of in terms of planning and environmental assessment processes. And there are some regulation I've heard of when it comes to the need for electricians during operation of solar power facilities and standards for building standards for wind power plants and so on. There are things, regulations like that create costs in Japan that do not exist elsewhere. But one should also be aware that the cost decrease that we have seen in the world is partly decreased cost to produce the equipment, the solar panels and the wind power plants. But there is also a decreased cost created by the experience of the local project developers and construction companies. And that learning part you need to go through in Japan as well. We need here to have companies that have the experience of how to build large-scale wind power plants and parks and so on. That is now evolving in the solar industry because there are investments made here, but it will require a bit of experience in wind power, biomass power, and geothermal to reach the level of the best performing countries.
Klaus?
Yeah. It's true that the costs of renewables are today higher than the power prices that we see on the power exchange in Germany. That's a gap also for the new units that are connected. And I must say, I expect that will stay like this for quite a while. Now, why is this the case? I think there are two main reasons. The first one is that at least in Germany we have no appropriate pricing for CO2. We have a CO2 regime in place, which currently gives a price of 1 ton CO2 of 6-7 euros. Now, with such a value, a renewable generation unit is not the right choice. From a pure economic point of view, and this really is a topic, that I think one has to address. But the problem is that if we would really raise the CO2 prices and we would only do this in Europe, it would be a massive disturbance of the industry. And therefore, this is something that you could do worldwide, but it's very hard to do it in a specific area of the world. So one option would be to only do it in the electricity sector, and this is also something that's discussed, but it's also not so simple to introduce it. So the inadequate pricing of CO2 is a big issue. The other one is that the difference between the renewables and the price we see on a power exchange are, of course, also a result of the very cheap conventional generation, which is now in place, which would not be in the place if we would optimize the system again. It's a result of a transforming process, because we have built units in the past which now turn out to be not economically feasible, but it's stranded investments, and it's also not economically feasible to tear them down. So they are leading to very low energy prices that we see, and of course that causes a higher need for subsidies for the renewables. This will end somehow when the transformation process is done, and then we'll see what the outcome is. Now, one third element, maybe just to add it, is that, of course, if we really heading for 80% of renewables, then also questions arise, because every time the wind is really blowing, the price will drop, and so this is also an open question. What does that mean? And our answer to that is that it's, of course, of very high value to build interconnectors, and this is then obvious if you come to such a situation that the energy keeps value also during phases where there is a locally tremendous surplus.
I'm not sure if I disagree with what you meant to say, but I think I disagree what I understood you saying. Sorry if that was complicated, but the cost of wind power now in Europe, building and operating a new wind power plant is lower than the cost of building and operating a new nuclear plant or a new coal-fired power station. We agree on that. The marginal cost of a wind power plant is lower than the marginal cost of a coal-fired power station or a nuclear power station. So wind power is, in all respects, the cheapest source of new electricity and the cheapest source of existing electricity. So we agree, okay. Then you have the problem that in a system like the German or North European market, where there are some incentives for renewables, you have a capacity that is increasing, resulting in low electricity prices, so that the old coal-fired power stations and nuclear power stations and gas-fired power stations are almost impossible to keep in operation. And we have power stations closing in Germany as well as in Denmark and Sweden. So the new renewable power is actually substituting the old existing thermal power plants. So then I think the competitive situation is to the advantage of renewables in all respects. The question is, when will the day come when the renewables will explode and outcompete all thermal power stations in a rapid way? And as I think we agree, that will take some time, because there will be a value of keeping some flexible thermal power stations to manage the variation in demand. But for the general economic competitiveness, the renewables are now taking off. I showed the unsubsidized solar even being possible in Italy and Spain now, where there is lots of sunshine. So I think it's not that much of a problem. It's just an opportunity. Thank you.
よろしいですか？はい。
Well, I think I agree with what Thomas has just said. So we have a gap of 10 years between Japan and Europe. So when we look at what's happening in Japan, we have the FIT system, which is quite effective. I believe that is quite effective. Now, it talks about pricing because of the FIT, but there's so much interest and attention to the price. However, another aspect is that it is the certainty of being able to gain income over a 20-year period, that you can expect or calculate the actual income over a 20-year period, which is an important financial aspect. When we look at the renewables, running cost is quite low. And so it is the initial investment, initial expenses, which are very large. So the fact that you need a very large initial investment means that there's going to be a huge risk. And of course, those of you from Europe need not to hear that explanation. But at the same time, you are guaranteed, or if you can guarantee through policies, that you could gain that income over a 20-year period, which can be used to convince the financial institutions to make the funding available. And in comparison to a thermal power plant, that is quite different in nature in case of renewables. And that's the reason why there's agreement to purchase over a 20-year period. And that's what we need in Japan. And if I may add something else, it does hold true for a nuclear power plant as well, because the initial investment is huge and the running cost for nuclear power is quite small. And so that it can only be conducted and invested by the monopoly power utilities. And so when we think about a new siting of the nuclear power, maybe it means that we will need to have that feed-in tariff system for a new nuclear power. So as to whether the running cost for a nuclear power plant is actually low or not, I think that's a different and separate discussion. But Mr. Yamaka, we had been discussing the cost issue. We had been looking at the surcharges in Germany. And then also in Germany, we have been looking at the high surcharge in Germany, and that the citizens have been forced to pay higher electricity charges. However, we also understand that in Germany there's great support from the citizens to that feed-in tariff and also the higher cost. So can you explain that to us? So why is it that the German citizens have agreed to the introduction of these systems?
The problem of cost, of preferential access, dispatch. Leaving that aside, let me just talk about what's happening in Japan. This preferential access or dispatch is very important for Japan. So based upon the merit order and the renewables with a lower marginal cost will win. It all depends on when the market is created. And renewables, I think we have to have a certain mass of renewables So the feed-in tariff has been introduced in Japan, and the priority for renewables has to be given. So priority, yes, we often discuss about priority or preference, but if you look at the text of the laws or the regulations for feed-in tariff, there's no mention of priority or preference. So as far as I understand it, we have yet to give renewables any preference or priority, and the government has given out a guideline for connection, grid connection, and there has been no change whatsoever to the text of that guideline. And concerning the priority in the grid, there are some rules, and that again has remained completely unchanged. So concerning priority for renewables, so when the feed-in tariff was introduced, I think we should have discussed this in conjunction. And in a way, we have left this priority issue, preference issue behind. And as I mentioned previously, in Germany, I think the citizens have subscribed to the equity of these renewable projects. So once a project is completed and these the citizens know that the power generated will be purchased based upon a defined and the defined revenues or fixed revenues will be coming in. And of course, if there is any uncertainty about this, then this project is not viable. So, and most citizens would like to have their power generated nearby. And I think that's true for any community. And one more point is that, and there is this price differential between Japan and overseas. And why is Japan, the cost in Japan higher? And in a renewables committee, price committee, and cost committee, there is discussion of why that is so. So comparing Germany and Japan, so where is there a difference of 2 to 1 concerning the cost and the tariff between Germany and Japan for solar? So maybe there's regulation, that's one element. Environmental assessment, that's another element, pushing up the costs. And concerning wind and the environmental assessments for wind, it took about 30 million yen, maybe 1 or 2 years. And then it's now taking 3 or 4 years, and the total cost might be 100 million yen for that. So there is a price and cost differential here for renewables. And concerning the connection, grid connection, whether we're talking about the grid itself, the transmission itself, the cost, the wheeling is expensive. Not just, I don't think, regulations, but I think it's customary to invoice a rather high price for the wheeling. And the solar panel itself is now a commodity product, so you can buy it off the shelf rather cheaply. But the related services are quite expensive. And so, and also the stability of supply of electricity in Japan, the safety of electricity. There again, we have some certain customs and conventions that we haven't really broken through. The electricity system and the thinking behind it in Japan is something we might have to change, and I think we need to have discussions as to how to do it, and do we really want to change this? And also, and financial costs are quite high in this country as well. So in Europe and the United States, and the reason why the renewables cost in Japan has decreased overseas is the financial costs are much lower. And there, of course, we have to study this renewables as a business and we have to set up a business model for it. And I think it's possible to overcome this problem in Japan. So I think the Japanese pursue too much this idea of everything has to be safe, that there should not be defects or there should not be any downtime. And many of the project owners say they don't want any downtime for this windmill or solar panel. And so the quality is very high, it's gilt-edged, but then the costs are exorbitant. So this is my guess of why the costs are high in Japan. And I think we really have to discuss and find out, identify why there is this differential, price differential and cost differential. Thank you.
3 comments. The first, that might have to do with translation, is regarding the argument of priority access for renewables. Once again, I do not think that renewables need to be given priority or treated with some favor, but renewables need to get a fair access on the same conditions as everyone else to the grid and to the market. And that is not, we're very far from that today, because the existing power companies control the grid and the competing power plants. Regarding transmission and distribution costs, the Japanese power companies are delivering cost estimates to independent power producers in Japan that seem to be much higher for transmission and distribution cost than the costs in Europe. Transmission is a fraction of a yen per kilowatt hour. The distribution in the low voltage grid is fairly expensive, but not at all as expensive as the power companies says in Japan. And if you had ownership unbundling, that would be settled and much more transparent and clear. Last, I'm a little interested in this argument on the cost of capital in Japan. In the rest of the world, the renewable energy industry always complain about the high cost of capital. And of course, renewable energy technologies are investment, they're capital intensive and very low cost in operation. So it is a very important variable. But all I know about the Japanese economy is that the interest rates are very low. And if I was a Japanese pension fund, I'd much rather invest in wind power than in government bonds paying 0.6%. And with that kind of interest rate, renewables should be cheaper in Japan than in other parts of the world where interest rates in general are significantly higher. So there is something worth looking into, why the availability of capital for renewable energy investments in Japan is not cheaper than in the rest of the world. And maybe it is possible to find lower cost capital here too. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。ちょっとさっき
So I think Klaus was talking about the CO2 pricing, and we didn't really talk about climate change or global warming today, but maybe this reflects what happened in Japan, because post 3/11, that is, say, the earthquake and the tsunami, I think everyone in Japan has forgotten and left aside this question of CO2 emissions reduction. And if anyone talks about trying to reduce CO2 emissions, he's thought as, or she's thought to be promoting the restart of the nuclear power plants. But we of course have been promoting, JRF has been promoting renewables, and in that process, and amongst the environmental NGOs, we have confirmed that promoting nuclear is not a way of attaining the stabilization of climate change. But, so leaving aside nuclear, but in order to promote renewables, so in Europe, I'm sure everyone agrees that this is one way in which to attain stabilization of climate change. Klaus, Yamaka-san, and any others who might want to comment, please.
I must say I agree. So it's totally correct. Yeah.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you. That was short. Thank you very much. Yes, it's not just global warming, but in the case of renewable energy, it relates to economy and employment as well. As Mr. Yamaka was referring to, that was a question I was going to ask, and ownership by the community. There are many, many benefits that we can get out of it. Yamaka-san, anything from you on this? Yes, so a power source with less CO2 emission is something that we would like to aim for. And security, energy security is another aspect. So in your country, make full use of what's available in the country, I believe as an incentive is large. Thank you. So the reason why I was raising this was next week there will be a summit on global warming and climate change. And in Japan, the target for the new framework, we don't know when that will come out. And so they're saying that it could be after the discussion on energy mix. But when we look at the other parts of the world, the renewable energy target and global warming target is not on a total level, but they first determine the respective targets and then get the overall global mix. So I think that's where Japan is lagging behind. That's why I raised this. Thomas-san?
Conflict between climate and nuclear decommissioning. If you remember the graph I showed of global development of non-fossil sources of electricity, I showed that in the world, renewables had increased dramatically in the last 10 years, whilst nuclear had stagnated and come down. This was before Fukushima. It was not a result of politics or public opinion or accidents. It was a consequence of technical and economic difficulties with nuclear power. Renewable power is easier to develop and faster. Don't forget, Japan's nuclear power reached its highest level of production in 1998. Long before the Fukushima accident. It collapsed after the Fukushima accident, but it had failed before that for technical and economical reasons. The cost of nuclear is the problem if you try to use it as a way of reducing carbon emissions. Renewables are simply cheaper. That's the reason. Thank you.
まあちょっと今のトーマスのコメントの後だと。
So after Thomas' comment, Dr. Takahashi, can you talk about the targets of global warming and the need for Japan to play a role there? Would this be the last question? We have 8 more minutes, actually. Okay, so this will be the last round of comments, right? So it's not just climate change, but to more or less summarize my viewpoints. I think in the past 4 to 5 years, I've been discussing energy, and the maximum highlight is that when we consider energy, the value which is not assessed in the market, how we should view the value which is not assessed in the market. I wrote a book on deregulation, and we need to use the market mechanism, especially in Japan. I think there's a lot more room to use market mechanism. But it's not a solution to everything. Market mechanism is not a solution for everything. And how we should judge. And politics and policy need to play a role. For renewable energy, as has been discussed, CO2 issues, it benefits that as well. And I totally agree with what Yamaka sensei was saying. But people who would like to see more renewables, when we look at what's happening in the Middle East, we need to be concerned. And there was a comment that Japan is energy rich, but we want to make and we need to make best use of what's available as a resource in Japan, and we need to consider that as a value and asset to the people of Japan. So when we assess that kind of value, putting aside whether it's going to be priority or not, I think we should introduce more of renewable energy. I think that's the discussion that we'll be having. And also nuclear power. People that promote renewable energy, they talk about security, and they say that zero emission from nuclear power, and also they say that nuclear would be necessary for certain armament purposes, though they don't say it out loud. So it's a political judgment, and the value, how much weight the people of Japan will place will make a difference. And Germans have been, in the past 20 years, have reached where we are now because they had a consensus. They had a view. We are behind by 10 years, 20 years in Japan compared to Germany. And I think as a researcher, I believe that it's because the people of Japan have been able to really debate on this. So this value, which is not assessed in the market, the people of Japan would need to really take up this issue as his or her own problem to see what should be done and what kind of burden they would be willing to pay as a burden. I think we seriously, as people of Japan, would need to really look at what's happening. Thank you very much for that. I think that was a very good summary. So I think this would be the last round of questions, maybe 1 minute each of comments from everyone. So Germany and Japan. So some people have raised, I think we have raised 3 people's questions. Would it be really meaningful to compare between Japan and Germany being so different? And what we can learn from Germany, I think, is becoming clear. So if you have any comments or messages from Germany to Japan, we would like to receive that from Klaus. And Yamaka-san, once again, if you would like to focus in the presentation, if you'd like to highlight a bit more on what we can learn from Germany. And Takahashi-san and Thomas to follow, please.
Yeah, as I said, I'm pretty sure that there's no blueprint for the challenges. It's good to stay in discussion. I think this event today is also very valuable. I mean, it's a lot of people sitting in this room. There's interest, so we can share ideas. We can explain decisions, and understanding each other. Definitely, I think will help to find the right solution also for Japan. It definitely is a challenge. I mean, also the situation, I think, is really very difficult in Japan because you just mentioned looking at CO2 emissions and not putting the nuclear generation back on the grid that is maybe decided from a technical point to be secure is, of course, something which is, from an engineering point of view, not very efficient. So there are really difficult decisions to take, how to, on the one hand, recognize facts, and on the other hand, somehow establish a transformation process that leads to an efficient solution for a CO2 low emission system in Japan, and that's publicly accepted from the price and also from the security aspects that can be delivered.
Thank you. So there was a question, why Germany to compare? So when we look at the Japanese circumstance, the Iberian Islands, and also we are isolated as an island. So some of you may think that we should learn from other islands, which is in isolation. But I think Germans, they are very precise, but they can also look at the overall picture. They have those multitude of aspects. And I was a banker before being in energy. So I went to Germany, and I learned a lot from Germany because they had their thoughts, and they had their macro and microscopic and logical perspectives. So I would always go to Germany and learn what was done there. So energy best mix is a problem that Japan has. And for this as well, I think spending 20 years for nuclear phase out and how to overcome that. Of course, between Germany and Japan, there are differences in terms of numbers. But I think this thinking process, I think we can learn from Germany, and I think that we will continue to learn from Germany in the future as well. Thank you. Dr. Takahashi, anything from you? Thomas, please.
もし高橋さん終わりになる。いいですね。はい。じゃあ、トーマスお願いします。
Thank you. I've now spent 3 years working for the foundation, doing my utmost to support the development of renewable energy in Japan. And I understand that as a foreigner who can't even speak the language, I can't do very much. But I'm very happy to see so many people here and have qualified colleagues on the panel, and I know some in the room who are working hard and learning a lot and contributing to this development. Comparing Germany and Japan, there are similarities. Germany and Japan are large industrial countries with a fairly dense population who cannot afford further nuclear accidents. Both are importing a lot of energy. But Germany actually has significant domestic coal resources. So Japan has an even stronger reason than Germany to be successful in develop renewable energy. And I think it is time for Japan to change the self-perception from one of being energy poor to realize that with a new industrial capacity that has evolved in the world, Japan can be energy rich. You just need to acquire the skill and ability to utilize your domestic resources, and that will strengthen the Japanese economy as well as Japan as a country. Thank you very much for joining in this work to succeed making Japan successful by utilizing renewable energy.
Well, for the 4 panel members, I would like to thank you for your participation. And so we will be concluding the panel discussion.